and thank you everyone for joining me in this session. I'm looking forward to sharing our collective experiences with volunteerism and hope you'll take away some valuable insights from me as well as each other that you can apply in your organization as you look to improve or expand your volunteer program. Okay, so a little bit about me. There we go. I grew up outside New York City and I've lived in New Hampshire for 32 years. And I have volunteered in some capacity pretty much since I was a child, and especially in college and now my adult life. I have a bachelor's in sociology and a master's in sport management with extensive experience in sport and community events as well as fundraising. I find my sociology degree is helpful in everyday life and especially when it comes to working in volunteer settings. I've read many articles and studies about volunteerism, but much of what I'm going to share with you today is really just my hands-on experience. I have a lot of experience with volunteerism from different perspectives, various organizations, as well as various positions, both the volunteer side and the organization side. And I look forward to sharing lessons that I've learned. So I was looking at who was coming in, and it looks like we have people from all over New Hampshire. And I know Michigan is well represented in this conference. So welcome to New Hampshire online. I'm not sure if there are other states that were represented. I didn't see everybody. But it looks like we have volunteer coordinators. We have service organizations such as Lions Club. We have political organizations, the Humane Society, AmeriCorps Vistas, City Year. So we have quite a range of organizations. And that will come into play a little bit later. For an overview of the session, I'm really just going to ask that as we spend this next hour together, you think about your knowledge and experience with your volunteer program now, as well as any personal experience you have as a volunteer. Being able to see things from different perspectives is the first step in recognizing what you're doing well and what you need to improve. We'll look at several things together today. A general definition of what a volunteer is, why we need volunteers and what we expect from them, why people volunteer and what they expect from their experience, how you are or can be delivering to your volunteers what they need while still meeting your organization's needs, identifying strengths and weaknesses of your volunteer program, or even just identifying the structure in which your program operates, thinking about that on a more conscious level. We'll talk about how and when to periodically evaluate the strengths of your program as well as individual volunteers and make those adjustments where needed. Let's see, we'll talk about evaluating your organization's expectations of your volunteers and making sure your volunteers meet them. And when they don't, determining how you're going to adjust them or part ways. And we'll have some questions and exercises throughout. As I said, I encourage you to make notes so that you can complete these exercises in greater detail later on. It's my hope that you'll take some of these thoughts and you'll work on it. It'll be a starting point for you as you move forward. Okay, so we're actually going to start with this breakout room exercise. Let me tell you what we're going to do. And then Lisa and Caitlin are going to work on getting you in there. We're going to start with small group discussion just to help your thought process get going. In your group, you want to have a couple of people volunteer to make some notes because I will ask you to report back when we get back. You'll have about 8 minutes or so to chat about your experiences and answer a couple of questions that you'll report back to the group. Use these prompts to guide your discussion, but please in no way, shape, or form are you bound by them. If your conversation takes a slightly different turn, that's okay. But generally, I'm looking for what are some of the key aspects of your program that are working and what is not, and what kind of support do you think you need to improve your program? And what you might want to do for note taking is just make a list and look for some similarities and differences between your organizations, the people in your group. All right, so I hope that everybody had some good conversation in their groups. I know the group I was in, there were some great ideas. And I did ask that each group take some notes because we want to hear back. And I know in the group I was in, I made the comment, gosh, they could be teaching this session because they were saying a lot of the things that I'm going to share. And I have a feeling all of you have the same experience from your groups. So let's have a brief report back from each group. And I think maybe Lisa, you can see who those people are or who those groups are. Or should I just call on them by group number? How many groups?
Yes, just groups 1 through 7, I believe we had.
1 through 7. Okay. Okay. All right. And I'm going to jot down some things too. So let's start with group 1. What's working? What's not working? What kind of support do you need to improve your program or anything along those lines that you can contribute to the conversation?
It looks like group 1 was Claire, Emma, Karen, Cassandra, Shannon, and Shelby.
So who in group 1 was going to be reporting back?
Karen, you were in group 1, and then I also see in the chat, Emma shared, we discussed the value of thanking volunteers as one topic.
Hey, Michaela.
Hello.
Yeah, our group, we had several brand new volunteer coordinators, as well as a number of AmeriCorps people. So I kind of did a little bit of a brain dump on them for the positive things that I've seen over the years. And I guess if you weren't in the AARP webinar this morning, I would suggest you watch the shared video because they did a great job. There was a lot of good stuff there. What I see missing a lot of times with the volunteer program is the volunteers don't know enough about the big picture of the organization. So, I don't know how often it would be appropriate to do that, but to share with the volunteers basically the strategic plan for the organization. Give them the tools to do an elevator speech because they're going to meet a lot of people. And if they have a good experience and they can tell people good things about your organization, it's really going to help you.
That's excellent. I love that. Just even thinking about what the strategic plan is, there are a lot of organizations that don't even have that to begin with. So that might be a first step before we even get to how do we include our volunteers in understanding. But that big picture piece, that's perfect. That's right on target for what I'm looking for. What else? Let's see. Michaela, you mentioned, someone commented in the chat, the value of thanking volunteers. Did I hear that correctly?
The value of thanking volunteers.
Thanking, yes. Yes. Well, I address both thanking and thinking, so we'll definitely hear more about that. Yeah, thanking volunteers is important too. Okay, were there any other comments from group 1? No? Well, why don't we move on to group 2?
Okay, group 2 is Abby, Fran, Kai, Lisa, Matthew, Micah, Michelle, and Rita.
I can offer some feedback from our group. So I think kind of like the overarching thing that we talked about was just the effect of COVID on this past year and our different experiences. Somebody shared that they were having difficulty recruiting volunteers. I shared that I actually have an overabundance of people interested in volunteering. I work at a nature center, so we have a lot of opportunities for working outdoors. We have a green team that does landscaping, etc. So, I have episodic opportunity that happens every Saturday, and I have anywhere from 40 to 60 people trying to get one of my 10 spots that I have available. So that's been one of the difficulties that we have encountered. Somebody also mentioned that they moved into a new space that's larger, which makes it both easy in some respects and difficult in others. So basically just things can go either way in terms of the things that can help one entity and how it's affecting, an entity in a different way.
That's an excellent point. As you were talking about one organization having difficulty recruiting volunteers while another one has too many. We'd like to think that the latter is a good problem to have, right? At least you have the volunteers to choose from, but we often forget how much effort goes into working with volunteers, and recruiting them and vetting them are those first steps that we need to take. And that takes a lot of time. I mean, it's like anything. If you get 10 applications or 20 or 40 or 100, obviously it's going to take more time to go through and figure out who's best for your program. But the positive in that is at least you have a larger pool to choose from. So you're more likely to get a fit. In your case, you might be more likely to have volunteers who stay with you longer, because not that we know when COVID's going to end and life will return to whatever normal is the new normal. But realistically, as things start to get more open and more back to whatever that normal is, we might see a lot of people who got involved in different activities start to pull back because they have to get back to other things. So on the flip side of that, maybe you get some lifelong volunteers you never would have had in the first place, and that would be awesome too. So that's really good points. COVID specifically has certainly added a little wrench into everything. Even when you think you're all set and things are going well, any change can still upset the process and cause you to have to pause and think, okay, how does this affect us? Does this affect us? What do we need to do now? So excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that. All right. What about group 3?
So that was your group, Corri, that had Christian, Holly, Lisa, Sarah, and Tina.
I told them I have high expectations of them to report back.
I can share back for group 3. So for group 3, we kind of discussed both what was working, what was not. We mentioned that creating a loyal community that believes in the cause is super important, and how it's also very helpful to transition from paper to digital. For example, like making schedules and having people sign up using websites like Volunteer Hub was really helpful in organizing things, and also using stipends as an incentive for volunteers to finish their work and complete whatever activities they needed to do. And we also put a lot of emphasis on the importance of communication, and how it's kind of difficult to properly communicate between like higher ups and members sometimes. And kind of that was what is the main support we kind of wanted to focus on, as in like suggestions on how we can communicate with within an organization, especially using virtual platforms, and kind of connecting all sides of the puzzle with like administration and members having all sides of the picture and what was going on with the organization.
Yeah, we had a good discussion about that. The fact that it's really important that everybody in the organization is aware of what's going on and the different levels of administration and volunteers, and that's an important factor. We're going to talk about that a little bit too. Good. Very good. Thank you. How about group 4?
Group 4 had Allison, Michael, Jessica, Molly, and Taylor.
Our group talked about most of the same things that have already been mentioned, how to keep volunteers who got involved during COVID engaged as more people are vaccinated and people are prioritizing spending time with family and taking vacations, things that they couldn't do. Someone mentioned a lot of the average age of their volunteers in the programs was 73. So how to make older individuals feel comfortable with volunteering during this time when there's not as many virtual opportunities for their program.
Okay. So can you expand on that just a little bit? Making older volunteers feel more comfortable, because I didn't quite get the end of that.
Just they work with seniors, so they would drive non-mobile seniors to appointments. Obviously, that's not
Okay.
very safe during COVID. So how do you, there's some volunteer opportunities just can't really transition remotely.
I see what you're talking about. Okay. All right. And then maybe even expanding on that is just the idea that how did organizations adjust? I mean, people still have to go to the doctor. People still have to get food. You know, how was that happening? So certainly some more challenges with that. And that's more stress on the recipient of the service, and that's more stress on the volunteers, and it's more stress on the organization. So very important. Okay.
Okay, room 5 had Amanda, Bruce, Jean, Linda, McKaylee, Patricia, Richard, Trent, and William. That was a big room.
We didn't really ask anybody to do this report, but I could just say that there was a lot of discussion about not being able to find volunteers during COVID, when people stayed home more with their families and had other things to do. It's also was hard to recruit younger people, and they ran emergency services, so they had a hard time if the person was 85, you know, the volunteer. So that was one thing that came up, the fact that COVID delayed them being able to meet and do their job of safety for the town. And one suggestion was that maybe because they had hard time recruiting younger people, they might want to make it sort of like a group, of a social group too, for part of that, because it's such a heavy job to worry about saving people from fires or accidents, or knowing how to do a certain machine, you know, that's going to take person out of having a barn fall all on them or something. So I felt a little bit like my work is very light compared to theirs. So, but anyway, I think I'm working on community efforts, really trying to make our organization community fun, and also doing serious things and working on issues that are important to our community. So we got new t-shirts that say caring, commitment, community on them. And we helped with a cleanup day and stuff like that. And so I don't know, but I find the people in the 20 to 40, 50 are busy with kids, and I know, at that time.
So you make a good point, which really may be just as exacerbated by the COVID situation, but there's always going to be certain parameters within certain age groups that may prevent them from volunteering or make it more difficult for them to volunteer. But at the same time, you want that age group represented. So that's something to think about. I think that age and experiences are things that we want from all realms, right? All age groups, all experiences. And while some may lend themselves better to certain circumstances, you know, if a person is working during the day, they can't be driving people around, but someone who's retired maybe can. or someone who's home with a child and can take the child in the car with them to drive someone around, that's possible too. But I love how you adapted and you're still doing programs in the community, right? And your shirts, the shirts is awesome. People love shirts, right? Any excuse to get a shirt.
And you can make a little money on it.
Well, that's even better if you can.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
Okay, what else do we have?
Are we ready for the next group? Okay, so that was Abby, Alice, Shira, Dana, Emma, Harvest, Jen, Jessica, Pat, and Thomas.
I guess I will pipe up for us.
Yay.
So I made a little bit of a list here of things we chatted about. Things that were working for us were incentivizing volunteer opportunities and being able to give them something in return for the hours that they give us. Also, mentorship program to help train and get new volunteers on board. Not working, it seems like everybody just doesn't have enough time, right? We need more staff, need more help. I know for our organization, we don't have a volunteer coordinator, and it would be really fantastic if we did. Some other things we talked about were volunteer burnout, specifically in regards to, this group was working with in the emergency COVID world. And so people came out really hot and heavy at the beginning and then experienced some burnout as it phased out. So holding them accountable and getting people to show up for the shifts that they sign up for was something else we talked about. And I think that's about it.
That's fantastic. Again, you all are doing this workshop for me. My goodness, like every point that I'm going to bring up, we've touched on, which is great. It tells me you're thinking along the same lines. So that's good. Of course, the things that aren't working is not good, but being here in community may make some of you feel a little bit more comfortable with the fact that it's not you necessarily, it's not your organization, it's just either a sign of the times or COVID specific, and that others are going through it, right? There's misery loves company. Hopefully we can get away from the misery piece and really make progress, and everybody will see some improvements that come naturally as a result of our communities opening up more again. And maybe to your point about burnout, taking care of ourselves and our physical as well as our mental health. And then some of it will need to make a little bit more concerted effort. We'll have to really put some thought into how do we go about changing these things or expanding, right? The idea of incentives came up a couple of times. Wouldn't it be nice if you didn't have to incentivize people? And most people will say that that's not necessary, but we all love it, right? We love the t-shirt, we love the takeaway, we love whatever the giveaway is. So if we can do that in a simple and cost-effective way, it's a nice way to show people that we're thinking of them and we appreciate them. And appreciation is a key factor among volunteers. All right, well, we have one more group. So what do we have to hear from them?
Okay, so that's everyone who hasn't been named so far. Audra, Beth, Caitlin, Christina, Elizabeth, Jillian, Larry, Lavanjo, Lynn, and Megan.
Nobody? That's okay. That's perfectly fine. Hopefully they had a nice conversation and maybe they're just hearing a lot of the same things they would have said. So why don't we move on then? Whoops. Why am I not? There we go. All right. Sorry, let me just reposition. I was taking copious notes. Thank you all. Let's talk about what a volunteer is. As obvious as that may sound, Webster defines a volunteer as a person who voluntarily undertakes or expresses a willingness to undertake a service, one who renders a service or takes part in a transaction while having no legal concern or interest. So I'm going to ask you if you agree with this definition or not. So if there's anyone who maybe doesn't agree or doesn't agree with the whole thing, maybe there's a hand raised or someone in a chat and we could get just some feedback on that. Are we seeing any response? No, that's okay. That's fine. All right. Well, I would say that the first part is certainly true. And it's a very simple definition, but it makes sense, right? We might all agree that a volunteer is someone who chooses to provide a service and is not paid for it. By comparison, an employee would be paid for their service. However, I would have you consider that the second part of that definition is not entirely accurate because while not a paid employee or contractor, volunteers will at the very least be required to follow organizational policies as well as municipal laws, so federal, state, any local laws. Additionally, I think we'd all like to think and hope that volunteers would take a significant interest in the work, although that may not always be true. But regarding the second part, it's important to know how laws apply to volunteers as opposed to employees, since there are some differences. And I just want to touch on a couple of those things. Liability and disability laws, for example, insurance, that category, those may apply differently to your volunteers. Whether it applies the same or not, your organization should have a very clear understanding of how those things apply to your volunteers. Do you need waivers from volunteers? What is the language needed in that waiver? Are you part of a larger organization or a parent organization which may have some standard documents and you would be required to use those documents? But what if you're not? What if you never used waivers before? So that's something to keep in mind. Also, what if a volunteer is injured while on duty for you? Has anyone here ever had any insurance related issues? A volunteer comes in, they do work for you. It could be they slip on the floor, or they're working with a client who becomes violent and hurts them. Those kinds of things, not to scare you, because I think we're all aware that things like that can happen, but those kinds of things are important to know in advance what's covered, how it's covered, how you would address that if that should arise. Are you prepared for it or not? Another example is employment law or labor law. For example, do the same restrictions on the number of hours someone can work as an employee apply to volunteers, right? We know that in some cases, an employee would be paid extra if they worked extra. Well, how does that apply to a volunteer who's not getting paid in the first place? And while volunteers cannot be paid, because that would essentially classify them as employees, can you provide incentives and other forms of compensation? How do you know if you can or you can't? And what can you or can't you provide? So things like that are important to know. And then certainly there are some broader legal issues and representation issues. So is there a difference in your organization between how a volunteer talks about your organization and to whom they speak versus an employee? And someone brought that up earlier, the elevator speech, right? How do your volunteers talk about your organization? Because oftentimes they don't know the catchphrases or the elevator speech or the official word for word mission or taglines that your organization uses. And you want to be sure that your branding and message are consistent. Also, what about the media? So let's face it, if you're doing a project or an event or something's going on with your organization, oftentimes you're going to have the media present, or they're going to call you and say, we want to do a story. We see this all the time. But what does that mean in terms of your volunteers and how they interact with the media? Now, some of these things may be covered in your organization's bylaws or articles of incorporation or policies and procedures manuals. So that's great. A higher level, I know we had the Lions Club. If you're part of Lions, you have your local club, but you also have your international organization. And a lot of these types of things are handed down so that you're consistent with the parent organization. But it's wise to plan for these things in advance. You don't want a volunteer to feel badly if they were to speak to the media, or worse, do or say something inappropriate because this wasn't addressed in training. So it's important to train them as to what they can and can't say and when they can and can't say it. If you have departments in your organization that take care of these things, that's great. If you have a legal department, if you have an HR department that can help you with all of this, that's great. But if you don't, it's really important to find outside professionals who can give you some advice on how to best address these. And I know that in New Hampshire, if you're a nonprofit, the state has many resources available, and I imagine that that's true in any state. So armed with all this information, you might then address these things in your PMP manual. I'm not going to presume everybody knows what that means. It's policies and procedures manual, and or a volunteer handbook, which we'll also discuss later on.
Carrie,
Yes?
to go along with the legal concern, it's important that the group and the individuals know about the Good Samaritan law.
That's a very good point. Thank you for bringing that up. There are definitely times when, and you have to check because it could be different in each state. Some have them, some don't. They're different. But, for example, volunteers who perform CPR and first aid at an event, if you're at a sporting event or whatever, knowing if you're covered by the law or how you're covered by the law is very important. So thank you for bringing that up. That's a really good point. All right.
We did also have a couple of things in
Sure.
the chat box. So Karen commented, be sure that you know the laws with regard to employees volunteering for your organization. And in her experience, it is totally worth the money to have a lawyer write or review a volunteer waiver. Or if you're lucky enough to have a lawyer on your board of directors, that might be a nice way to go as well. And then I think this kind of feeds into your next slide. Patricia commented, I think, whoops, scrolled up. I think most volunteers are motivated by their life goals in some way, maybe not a legal concern, but definitely do have some interest.
Yeah, I think that the majority of people that we work with as volunteers have an interest in the organization, the service it provides, or something about it that draws them to it beyond just getting experience or padding a resume, if you will. So, but yeah, here we go. Why do people volunteer? And I know that this probably is going to seem very basic, but it's really important to remind ourselves from time to time and not take for granted why people volunteer. So we've defined what a volunteer is and maybe the scope of what they can and can't do to some extent in your organization. But take a minute to think about the following and maybe make some notes for yourself. Why do you think people volunteer for your organization? So I'll give you a minute to just kind of mull that over. All right, so if you're solely run by volunteers, think about the positions you have in place in your structure, because you're going to have people who run the organization and probably people who oversee your volunteer program. If you're a larger program, that may be multiple people, different people. If you're a small program, you might be doing double duty. You know, your board of directors is basically going to be in charge of running everything, right? Just depends on what kind of organization you have. Do certain roles require more than others of your volunteers? How do your volunteers compare to your paid staff? What do your paid staff do? And then what role do your paid staff have in supporting your volunteers? So the specific reasons why people will want to volunteer may depend on the type of organization, but in general, volunteers may enjoy a variety of personal and professional benefits. So maybe you can shout out or put in the comments, what are some of the reasons you think people want to volunteer for your organization? Let's just maybe have 2 or 3.
I can contribute to that.
Sure.
Hi, my name is Alana. I'm with City Year, and I think from what I've heard this year and what people have said on the topic, that a lot of people have seen in their own personal experience in the school system that they want to change something, and I think now they are coming to an age where they can. So I think that personal effect on your community is a big motivator for most people.
That's awesome. I love that. People want to change something. And it struck me when you said now that people are coming to be a certain age and they feel they can do something. I would really like to think that at pretty much any age, anyone can elicit change. That change may be very rudimentary at a young level, at a young age, or they may need assistance from others to make that change happen. But I think at any point in our lives, if we see a need for change, we should feel empowered to step up. And hopefully there are organizations for whatever that change is, or avenues for that change. Sometimes there is not, and would-be volunteers actually need to create those avenues for change. Right? We see that a lot with the development of organizations that didn't exist before. So that's excellent. Thank you. Did we have any other comments come up?
Yeah, we have a whole bunch in the
Ooh.
chat. And it seems like the common themes are things like giving back to the community, paying it forward, staying active in general or within the community, feeling connected, sense of community, enriching their lives and supporting others.
That's fantastic. All right, that's pretty much most of what's on my list. I think that in a word, volunteers just want to feel valued and appreciated, and they want to learn and they want to contribute. So if we had to sort of boil it down, that's where we'd be. I have to tell you, this conversation is good and the communication between all of us is good. And I know I'm going to run out of time, but that's okay. That's okay. I do want to touch on this concept of what does it mean to be just a volunteer? Because that's what this session is called. What is it? What does just actually mean? So should volunteers be held to the same standard of accountability as paid employees? Should volunteers be expected to learn about your organization? That's come up a couple of times. Should they be trained, have goals to meet, be reviewed? Or do they just show up, do what we ask them to do and go home? So here are some questions to think about, and I'm just going to read through them. And if you have a question, certainly we can address it. Does everyone in your organization buy into the idea of using volunteers? Obviously, this is in an organization where you have paid staff. Do they understand that volunteers are more than just free labor? Do they treat volunteers with the same respect and interest that they do employees or others in leadership positions? Do you use volunteers to get around having to pay for more employees, or because your model doesn't allow for employees? Or do you use volunteers because your organization can't afford more employees? I think we're hearing a little bit of that coming up. Do you want thinker doers or just doers? And by that, I mean, do you want people, as I said, who just come in, do the work and go? Or do you want people who truly become invested in your organization and they share their thoughts and their perspectives in an effort to help you achieve more? Should volunteers be entrusted with higher level responsibility? And if so, what does that mean for your organization? All these questions relate back to understanding and expectations that both the organization and the volunteer need to discuss. All right. So I would suggest that volunteers need to be responsible and held accountable. And we heard that come up a couple of times. How do you ensure that people turn in their paperwork on time or that they show up for their shift? This is all very important. But this comes from clarifying the expectations, and that comes from communication, which some of you have said in your organizations maybe need some work. So think about that. So I'm going to share 3 points that I think might help. One is that organizations should provide onboarding, that initial training when people come to your organization, and ongoing training as needed to educate volunteers on the organization's mission, background, policies and procedures, and the daily work of the organization itself, as well as the volunteers' actual tasks, right? That's a lot of stuff to train people on. But think about it. How do you onboard new volunteers? What kind of ongoing training do you provide? Is your training comprehensive, or is it just relevant to their particular job? How do you help volunteers feel knowledgeable so that they can safely, legally, effectively, and hopefully joyfully complete the work in which they are engaged? Another point, organizations should create an environment and a process of supervision in which volunteers can do their work but also feel supported. Most volunteers, just like most employees, don't want to be micromanaged, right? They want to be told, here's what we need the end result to be. Here are the parameters that legally or, from a policy perspective, we need you to know. But the rest is up to you. Go, do, be good, do good, right? What would that environment look like? If your environment doesn't look like that, what needs to change? Also, does your organization have a written handbook of any kind? Most employers have an employee handbook. Some don't, but most do. But do you have a volunteer handbook? It's probably not the same as an employee handbook. There are a lot of differences. Or maybe it's a section of your overall handbook that is just for volunteers. You could have something that's very simple, an outline that they have in writing, and then you just talk to them in a session to train them. But there needs to be something. Let's see. And then you need to think about what are some of the policies and procedures that need to be in that employee handbook. So job descriptions, very important. What are the tasks and responsibilities for that person's job, but then maybe what other people in the organization do? What's the process for checking in and out if you're a volunteer? When and how can you take breaks as a volunteer? I mean, these are all things that sound kind of silly, but they're important. And in some circumstances, they're crucial. You can't leave the phones unstaffed. You can't leave a locked door with no one to open it. What are policies on confidentiality? And as I mentioned before, who can and can't represent the company? Who can sign contracts and can't? Can volunteers take pictures of clients, of the people that they're working with? What is your policy on that? And then a big one these days, social media policies. Just as we're hearing a lot about employees who are not at work, but are posting about work. What is your policy for social media? And then reporting on incidents that occur. So what is the volunteer responsible for reporting and to whom when things happen? There are probably dozens more, and those are specific to your organization, but just something to keep in mind. And I'm just going to plug in my computer there. Something else to talk about when we talk about being just a volunteer. While the volunteer is not getting paid and may have fewer responsibilities, once they commit, they're no longer just a volunteer. You're relying on them. Your organization's relying on them. Everybody who's working them is relying on them to be where they're supposed to be, do what they're supposed to do. That needs to be thoroughly explained. And there are always a small percentage of volunteers who don't meet your expectations. They arrive late, they leave early, they may be not as thorough as they should be, they don't meet deadlines, they don't call, all those typical things. But for the most part, I found that given the opportunity with proper training and support, most volunteers take their role very seriously. All right. I'm going to skip a couple of things here. I just want to touch on, and I can share my actual notes if anyone wants to read them. It's more like a thesis. One of the ways to develop a strong program or improve your program is to ensure mutual benefit and fit. When you vet your volunteers from the start, when you ensure that their goals match with your goals, their skills match with your needs, you're more likely to have success in the long run. You want your volunteers to know what to expect from the organization before they agree to work with you and what to expect ongoing. And then you have to determine if you are meeting those expectations for them and if they are meeting your expectations. But what happens when there's not a fit or something changes over time and the person no longer really belongs there? And I wonder how many of you have had this experience yourself or you know of it in your organization. You have a volunteer that's really good at the work they do, but their personality is just not right for the organization. Or they're very likable, people love working with them, but they just don't do a good job. And then there are people who have neither of those. They're lazy, irresponsible, disagreeable, and they're also bad at the work they do. Sometimes you don't know all of this until you're really in the midst of working with the person. They seem good on paper. They seem good in that initial interview. It doesn't always work out that way. And I would say at some time or another, we've all experienced this in some way. The key is not to let it go on too long, right? You want to catch these things early on. And you want to have a plan in place for working with that person. If you like the person, you want to keep them, they maybe just need some tweaking, have a plan in place to monitor that. It's very much like an employment situation, only it may be even easier to let someone go if they're not an employee. But the ideal volunteer situation is one in which both the volunteer and the organization benefit. And you just want to make sure you have a process in place for that. All right, let's see. Oh my gosh, this really could be its own session, strategies for training and evaluating. And I've kind of talked about some of them already. But do you do initial onboarding? Do you do ongoing training? Are volunteers included in discussions for developing or improving your training process? And that's key because they see things from a different perspective. It's really important to get them involved in any changes you make or any training you implement. You also need to prioritize, right? There's a lot of things you're going to want from your volunteers. You may not be able to get everything that you want from them. Before accepting someone for a volunteer position, ensure that they have a clear understanding of what the role entails and continue to address that over time. Does your volunteer training include reviewing core values of your organization, providing clear expectations, learning who the other staff are? Even if they don't work with people daily, it's good for them to know who people are and what their roles are. And then even some of the real everyday nitty-gritty kind of things, like where do they find the pens and the paper clips? What happens if they can't come in? Who do they contact? We sometimes take for granted those things, but it's important to cover them. The implications of the challenges are greater with long-term volunteers than they are with short-term. So if you have a one-day event or a weekend event and something doesn't quite go right, at least it's going to be over and done, and maybe you'll never have that volunteer work with you again, whatever the case may be. But for a longer term situation, you really want to make sure that you have a good strategy in place, that you're working with volunteers to train them and to touch base periodically. I just want to touch on a couple of more points, and I'll keep them brief. One of the traps that organizations often fall into is that of assigning a volunteer to a specific task and then only that task, and never asking or offering for greater opportunities for learning and contributions. When asking yourself what just a volunteer means, consider whether you're empowering your volunteers who aspire to do more in their role or step into greater leadership opportunities. I have an example of a person who was in a volunteer role and really did her job well. And the contributions were such that the organization didn't even think they could go back to ever not having this volunteer. And they actually found a way to fund it as an employment position. So sometimes you realize, people have so much to give that they go above and beyond and really improve the organization with their involvement. All right, let me skip over that. Gosh, sometimes when you're doing this, you think you have all the time in the world. All right, I'm going to leave you with an exercise. So your job when you leave here today, when you're done with this conference and you go back to your regular everyday world, the very fact that you're here in this session suggests you want to improve your experience or your volunteers' experience, or at least review and reinforce what's going well. And I think it's important that you write down at least one goal. What's something you want to do better or different? What's something that you haven't done that you think maybe now you should be doing that will improve your organization's volunteer program? Start with that and then see where it leads. Do you need to involve other people? Do you need to talk with your volunteers? A short-term example would be go out and buy some thank you notes and write 10 notes a week until you get through your whole volunteer list and send them out and thank them for doing a good job. No other agenda, just thank you for being part of our organization and all you do for us. A longer term goal might be creating a volunteer handbook if you don't have one. But the most important thing is putting it down on paper, because if you don't, and I say that not quite literally, obviously you can put it in your phone, wherever it makes the most sense for you. But it's important to have a thought when you leave here, because I've said a lot, you've each said a lot. We want to make sure that you don't lose everything in the overwhelming aspect of having so much information thrown at you. So let me just wrap up with a few final thoughts just to kind of bring it all together. Keep in mind the purpose of your volunteer program and the value that your volunteers bring to your organization. Be clear with your volunteers and ask them to be clear with you. Provide volunteers with opportunities for training, both initially and ongoing as needed. Make it clear what your expectations are for training. Provide opportunities for your volunteers to learn and grow personally and professionally, and to get back from their experience and not just to be giving to your organization. Evaluate volunteers and get their feedback regularly to ensure a continued good fit, a positive experience, and that your goals are being met. Thank your volunteers and recognize them. Remind them that you accepted them because you believe they have something of value that they can add to your organization. And with that, I thank you for your time. I know we went right to the last minute. If there are any questions, I'm certainly happy to answer them now, but you're also welcome to join us in the Q&A session tomorrow, or you can reach me directly at my email address. And just put in the subject line something referencing the conference so it won't get lost when I go through it. So thank you.